Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown. Tonight, we're diving into a terrifying true story that haunts not only the people of Ohio but anyone who has ever heard it. The horrifying Halloween night crime in Ohio. This tale takes us back to Halloween night in 1992. When darkness engulfed a small town and a bloody mystery unraveled within the Liske family home. But the most chilling part? The killer was none other than the son of the murdered man. Dressed in a horrifying Halloween costume, he unleashed a terror that still haunts the community to this day. Listen closely as we recount each mysterious detail of this story. Do you have the courage to face it? Ohio, 1992 Halloween night. The autumn wind brought an unusual chill, drifting through narrow streets and houses that stood silent like shadows in the mist. The eerie Halloween atmosphere blanketed the town, with pumpkin lanterns set on doorsteps, faint light seeping from twisted grins carved into their faces. Yet behind the glow was an unsettling silence, as if even the wind was holding its breath. On the edge of town, the house of William Liske lay quiet, seemingly forgotten for ages. The roof was weathered, walls stained with mold, and the front yard overgrown with weeds. Those passing by felt an inexplicable heaviness. The entire house was shrouded in darkness, save for the faint glow of a porch light. But inside, a silent storm was brewing. William, a middle-aged man with deeply sad eyes, sat in his familiar chair. He didn't think there was anything special about tonight. It was just another Halloween, like every other year. Yet deep down, he sensed a strange unease, a chilling feeling he couldn't explain. It lingered in his mind like a cold breeze slipping through the cracks. Clinging to every breath, footsteps echoed slowly down the hallway, heavy and deliberate. The door creaked open, and in the shadowy frame, a figure appeared. Brian, his son, stood there in eerie silence, clad in a terrifying Halloween costume. A mask covered his face, revealing only his dark, lifeless eyes. The weak glow from the porch light flickered across the mask, contorting its features into a twisted, malicious grin. William looked up, his gaze meeting the cold eyes behind his son's mask. Something inside him tightened, an inexplicable, vague fear that strangled his breath. He cleared his throat, trying to inject a friendliness into his voice that he himself didn't truly feel. "Brian, where are you planning to go so late tonight?" His voice was gentle, but his hands clenched the armrest, struggling to maintain his composure. Brian remained silent, not a single word, just an empty stare from behind the mask. William was used to his son's distance, but tonight, the silence had a terrifying weight to it, as if it concealed something dark and sinister that he dared not face. For a moment, William thought he saw an unusual gleam in Brian's eyes, a cold, unfeeling light he had never seen before. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words lodged in his throat as Brian stepped forward, each step slow and soundless. Brian's mask glinted under the faint light, the crooked smile on the plastic seeming to come alive, mocking him in the darkness. William felt like a small prey, trapped in a cage that was closing in, while Brian was the cold, ruthless predator. "What do you want?" William managed to whisper, his voice weak and meaningless. Brian stopped, standing directly in front of him, his tall figure blocking out the light completely. William could hear his son's breathing, heavy and deep, like the growl of a beast waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Time felt frozen, the air thick and suffocating, each second stretching endlessly, like a death sentence. Suddenly, Brian reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out a knife. The blade glinted in the darkness, its cold, metallic shine like a sharp grin poised to strike. William wanted to scream, to call for help, but his voice was smothered by terror, disappearing completely. Brian's eyes locked onto his, devoid of emotion, devoid of mercy. They weren't the eyes of a human, they were the eyes of a hunter. A cold-blooded creature carrying out a blood-soaked mission. In his final moments, William realized that his son was no longer his son. Something had taken over him, turning him into a dark shadow filled with death and malice. And then, the first stab fell, marking the beginning of a nightmare the town would never forget. The next morning, a thick fog blanketed the town of Ohio. The suffocating air from Halloween night still lingered, while the pumpkin lanterns had burned out on doorsteps, leaving behind hollow faces grinning into the void. Yet, no one could smile that morning. A neighbor, Mrs. Margaret, was the first to notice something unusual. She was a sensitive woman, often insisting there was something odd about William Liske's house, as though the very walls absorbed some form of evil. When she noticed the front door of the Liske house ajar, a chill ran down her spine, as if a cold wind from hell was urging her forward. Hesitantly, she approached the door, the creak of the wooden floorboards sounding like an ancient echo from the depths of the earth. "William?" she called, her voice weak in the eerie silence. No response. The house was disturbingly quiet, as if it had stopped breathing long ago. When she stepped into the living room, the sight before her almost made Margaret collapse. William sat there, in his favorite chair, but his eyes had lost all life. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the void with an indescribable horror. Around him, dark streaks of blood clung to the walls, stretching in long lines, as though even the very space around him trembled at the sight of such violence. The shock left Mrs. Margaret frozen for a moment until she finally screamed, her shriek piercing the fog and echoing throughout the town. Within minutes, police and townspeople gathered, all horrified at the gruesome scene inside the Liske home. But what haunted them most was the Halloween mask lying next to William's body. The mask, with its twisted grin, seemed to mock the death that hung thickly in the air. The police tried to gather evidence, but everyone was left powerless against the brutality of the crime. Who had killed William, and why? The blood trails on the floor led out to the front door, then vanished, as if the killer had simply evaporated into the fog. By mid-morning, after conducting the investigation, the police uncovered an unimaginable truth. The killer was none other than Brian Liske, William's only son. He had left home that night, wearing his blood-stained Halloween costume to attend a party as though nothing had happened. This news shook the small town to its core, as Brian, a young man known to everyone as kind and Halloween-loving, was now suspected of being a murderer. Panic spread everywhere. People began to speculate wildly, saying Brian might have been possessed, or that he had performed a dark ritual on Halloween night in exchange for some twisted power. Mothers began to worry, keeping their children indoors, while townspeople watched the police's every move, searching for any sign of the truth in the thick, murky fog. But the most haunting part was the image of Brian when the police found him at the Halloween party on the far edge of town. Brian was still wearing his Halloween costume, with his mask covering his face, making everyone around him uneasy. The crowd began to back away, no one daring to approach him, as if he were a ghost among the living. Brian stood there, motionless on the dance floor, his cold eyes behind the mask staring blankly into space, showing no sign of emotion, though the party's music continued to play. In the minds of those watching, everything had stopped, leaving only a growing fear. The crowd grew silent. All that remained was the ticking sound of a wristwatch, marking each second in the suffocating, eerie atmosphere. The police approached Brian and escorted him outside, but the most terrifying thing was that he said nothing. Not a word, not an expression, just a chilling silence. Each of Brian's steps echoed in the night, as if the ground itself shivered beneath him. Some swore they saw a cold light in his eyes behind the mask, as if they were no longer the eyes of a human. In the interrogation room, Brian sat still, his empty gaze directed into space, showing no reaction to the police's barrage of questions. They tried to understand his motive, why he had killed his family, but only received a haunting silence. Brian just sat there, his blank stare and eerie grin still etched into the minds of all who saw him that night. The town's dread began to spread. People were afraid not just of the crime, but of the feeling that something dark, something otherworldly, lurked in Brian's mind. News of the murder quickly circulated throughout Ohio, yet no one dared to go near the Liske family house anymore. The entire town became haunted by the image of Brian, a cold-blooded killer with lifeless eyes, the Halloween mask still clinging to his face. Neighbors began hearing footsteps in the Liske house at night, ghostly laughter echoing from empty rooms, and occasionally, a shadowy figure would appear in the window, gazing out with eyes burning like the fires of hell. It was only the beginning, and the tale of the man in the Halloween costume would haunt this town of Ohio forever. The next morning, a thick fog blanketed the Liske family's house, and the air was heavy with the scent of dampness mixed with dried blood. In town, no one dared to mention the name Brian Liske without a shudder. Rumor had it that if you stood still long enough in the eerie mist outside the Liske house, you could hear a cold sigh and faint knocking coming from within its walls. Although the police had cleared the scene, the stain of the massacre lingered, as though the house itself refused to let it be forgotten. At the police station, Brian sat in the interrogation room, silent as a shadow, not a sound, not a movement, only his deep, dark eyes staring into the void, as if they were pulled into a world that no one in town could comprehend. Dry blood clung to his hands, his shirt still stained with dark, unsettling patches, but the room was filled with an almost suffocating silence, a silence that hinted at something deeper, darker than any crime. Inspector Hall, a tall man with silver hair and piercing eyes, sat across from Brian. He had encountered killers, cold-blooded murderers, but never before had he felt the presence of evil as palpable as this. With Brian, this wasn't a momentary madness or a spontaneous act of violence. There was something else here, a suffocating heaviness that even Hall couldn't quite put into words. "Brian," Hall began, his voice echoing in the still room like a curse. "Can you tell me what happened?" Brian didn't respond, his gaze fixed on some unseen point. The Halloween mask lay in front of him, its twisted smile seemingly mocking Hall, mocking life itself. Hall sensed that Brian's eyes were drawn to the mask, as if something within it was calling to him. Finally, a slow, icy smile crept across Brian's face, more chilling than any words could be. Hall shivered but didn't look away. He had faced monsters of all kinds, but he had never seen one in the eyes of a young man who had once been a kind son. "A Halloween lover. Do you believe in things you can't see?" Brian asked, his voice low but razor sharp, the sound slicing through the thick air in the interrogation room. Hall remained silent, observing him. Brian's words felt like a riddle, a question hanging in the air, haunting him. "Something got inside me, you know?" Brian continued, his eyes fixed on the mask. "That night, I wore it, and from that moment, I was no longer myself." Hall said nothing. All he felt was his skin growing cold, like a shadow had just passed over him. "You know," Brian whispered, his eyes gleaming in the darkness, "this mask has a soul. It's a gateway, a door, and when I put it on, I felt something entered me." Hall swallowed, unable to look away from Brian. But what frightened him most wasn't what Brian was saying, it was the way he was saying it, as if he truly believed it. And Hall himself was beginning to question the boundary between the real world and the inexplicable. "People think Halloween is all fun and games," Brian said, his voice gradually rising, "but they're wrong. Halloween is when the boundary between worlds blurs. And when I put on that mask, I opened a door for something to come through. It used my body, my hands, and I couldn't stop it." Hall leaned back, too afraid to continue questioning. He looked at Brian, but the only thing he saw was a dark abyss staring back at him. Meanwhile, back at William Liske's house, the townsfolk still gathered nearby, watching from a distance. Although the police had blocked off the scene, people felt an inexplicable urge to witness, as if some dark, horrible mystery still lingered within that house. That night, Mrs. Margaret, the one who had discovered the crime, couldn't sleep. In a moment of weakness, she opened her bedroom window, looking out at the dark house across the street. In the sharp cold, she saw a shadow standing in the window of William's room. The shadow, tall and blurred by the mist, stood there as if looking straight at her. She didn't dare move. Her eyes widened, her heart pounded, searching for a rational explanation for what she was seeing. But then, like a curse, she heard a faint laughter, a chilling laugh that was beyond description. Margaret knew it wasn't the laughter of the living. The next morning, she shared her story with a few neighbors. They stayed silent, exchanging horrified glances. Everyone thought Margaret was seeing things. But then, one by one, they started having similar experiences, shadows flitting past windows, footsteps echoing from the empty house, and occasionally, a haunting laugh that sent chills down their spines. Everyone in town knew something had happened that Halloween night, something that crossed Halloween's threshold and entered their lives. Brian Liske was just the vessel, the one who opened the door for the darkness to step through. And now, that shadow had become an indelible part of the town, of the Liske house, of every dream and every fear that haunted them in the dark. People began to speak of the mask, saying it still lay somewhere in the police station, and that the eyes on the mask were watching. observing them all, and the biggest question, the greatest fear, was, did that evil still linger in the mask? Or had it found a new way to haunt someone else? Night fell once again over the town of Ohio, bringing with it an oppressive and uneasy feeling, something the townsfolk couldn't shake, like a chilling shadow hanging in the air, filling the night sky with an invisible menace. In the corner of town, where the sounds of Halloween still echoed, Brian Liske, his face hidden behind that eerie mask, stood motionless among the crowd. This was the Halloween party he had come to right after leaving his family's house. Without a word, without an expression, people gathered around Brian, seemingly unaware of the darkness festering within him. He stood still, his vacant eyes staring at the painted faces laughing around him. Among the music and voices, the darkness seemed to thicken, blending into the air like a cold breeze that sent shivers down spines. Yet no one dared to speak of it. A young woman, dressed as a witch with a pointed hat, approached Brian, laughing and offering him a drink. The red light from Brian's mask cast an eerie glow on her face as she looked closely at it. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice blending with the lively music. But Brian didn't answer, his gaze remaining distant as though she didn't exist. A chill ran down her spine as she realized there was something profoundly wrong within him. Something lurking behind that mask. Then, as though compelled by some unseen call, Brian left the party. He stepped outside, into the cold night, leaving behind the laughter and the joyful sounds. His feet led him back toward his house, as if it were a path set for him, as though the sinister mask had already mapped his journey. On the way home, Brian wasn't alone. He felt something following him, a shadow hiding in the night. It wasn't anyone else's footsteps but rather a low sound, like the steady, heavy breathing of an unseen presence. Brian's eyes blinked behind the mask, and he turned, catching a fleeting glimpse of something in his vision. The shadow stood there, not fully formed but close enough for him to feel its chilling presence. The night seemed endless as Brian walked through the thick fog, the darkness wrapping around him, swallowing each step. His eyes, glinting behind the mask, gleamed with an unnatural light, as if the mask itself had taken on a life, seeing the world through him. The shadow, in some twisted way, was smiling. When he arrived home, an overwhelming dread surged within him. The front door, now marked with his family's dried blood, loomed before him. He stepped inside, his feet heavy as lead. The space around him seemed to close in, each step drawing him deeper into the darkness. Brian walked into the living room where his father had once sat on that fateful night. The chair remained, empty and silent, yet the air around it felt strangely alive, as if it still held William's last gaze, frozen in eternal horror. Then, a faint sound broke the silence. At first, just the soft creak of wood, but soon it morphed into whispers. Distorted and fragmented, Brian stood still, eyes scanning the room, but he saw nothing. Yet the sound persisted, growing clearer, as if someone was whispering from far away, but close enough that he could feel their cold breath near his ear. "Do you remember?" Brian startled, looking around the room, but no one was there, only the dense shadows wrapping around him. And within that darkness, his father's eyes seemed to appear in the corners, from the silent void, staring at him, filled with anger and hatred. "My son," the whisper echoed, clear and terrifying, as if coming from the deepest depths of hell. "You opened the door, and now, you will face consequences you could never imagine." Brian felt his body go cold. The mask on his face seemed to cling to his skin, no longer just a lifeless piece of plastic but a living entity merging with him. He tried to pull it off, but each tug made it feel as though it were melting into his flesh, sending sharp, searing pain across his face. Then, for a moment, he saw himself in a fractured mirror nearby. He was no longer Brian. His eyes had turned dark, deep as a bottomless pit, and the face beneath the mask seemed distorted, like a creature transformed, a soul imprisoned within a human body. In that instant, Brian understood that he was no longer just a victim of evil. He had become evil itself. A dark entity Halloween had brought from the shadows to the light, to spread terror upon all who dared to trespass its domain. William Liske's whisper continued to echo through the space, a twisted, nightmarish laugh, scratching along the walls with each horrible screech. And Brian, now completely lost to himself, knew he had no way to escape. As the nightmare reached its peak, The entire town of Ohio sank into a dreadful silence. The dark night, thick fog covering the skies like a shroud, filled the air with an ominous presence. The massacre of the Liske family quickly became a dark legend, one everyone wanted to forget, yet no one could truly erase. And on that Halloween night, the tale of the man in the Halloween costume became a haunting specter. Brian Liske, or the entity that had possessed his body, was nowhere to be found. He had vanished from the police station, a mystery so chilling that it sent shivers down the spines of every officer in town. The interrogation room was left in a strange state. Brian's Halloween mask lay on the floor, a blood trail stretching from his seat, forming twisted shapes on the cold tile. People swore they could hear faint laughter coming from within the mask, an eerie sound that made them believe it was an echo from hell. Brian was haunted by shadows. In the days after his escape, rumors spread that some had seen his figure wandering through the dense forest north of town. Curious townsfolk decided to investigate, but each time they ventured deeper, they felt an invisible pair of eyes watching from every hidden corner. That spine-chilling feeling engulfed them, forcing them to turn back, abandoning their search, their eyes filled with horror as they swore never to return. Meanwhile, Mrs. Margaret, the neighbor who had seen William's shadow in the Liske house window, grew increasingly unhinged. Locking herself in her house and refusing to speak to anyone, the invisible whispers never ceased in her head, murmuring of an unforgivable crime. And Brian's face, with eyes glowing like the fires of hell, haunted her every dream. 1 year later, on Halloween, the town had tried to return to normal life, but the Liske tragedy clung like a dark shadow no one could escape. The following Halloween night, people gathered, everyone sensing the chill and suffocating tension in the air. The pumpkin lanterns still glowed, but no one dared to jest. Adults stayed indoors, children no longer wore costumes, everyone trying to ignore Halloween, hoping it would pass peacefully. But, as an omen, at midnight, a noise echoed from the Liske house, shocking the townsfolk. A crowd gathered, standing from a distance, their eyes filled with terror. In the darkened window, a familiar figure appeared, the same mask with its twisted grin, eyes blazing red in the darkness. The townsfolk screamed and fled, but in their hearts, everyone knew that Halloween could not be ignored, that the cursed mask was still there, and it would never leave. In the dead of night, the whispers about Brian Liske returned, of the mask with red eyes and the curse he had left behind. Some people swore that, from that Halloween night on, the cursed mask began to appear in other places around town, from dark corners to mirrors inside their homes, and each time it appeared, its red eyes would stare unblinking at anyone who dared to look. A silent warning that the curse continued, that darkness would always return each Halloween night, waiting, watching, and that was the horrifying Halloween night crime in Ohio, a chilling, haunting tale of terror. Ever since that night, the Liske family home is said to be cursed, with rumors claiming that every Halloween night, the shadow of the man in the Halloween costume returns, silently watching anyone brave enough to step into his domain. Thank you for sticking with us to the end. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next spine-tingling story. Wishing you all a truly haunting Halloween night.